And well, today we're supposed to have Jeff McGuiness and Jim Graham. Jeff is here. Jim has yet to show. Hopefully he'll get here while we're going to let Jeff talk. Otherwise, we'll have an abbreviated day, or else we'll just keep asking Jeff questions. So Jeff is here going to talk to us about Bear Me into Freedom. Jeff's in Maryland, where not far from where we came from before we moved to South Carolina. So a little tie also into why he's here today. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off and let Jeff take it away.
Okay. All right. This is always the big moment. And I don't think it worked, did it?
It's starting to.
All right,
There you go. Yep, you're good.
Okay. Is it working?
It's good.
You just see my PowerPoint?
Yeah. Well, we see. Yeah, we also see the next slide, but yeah.
Okay. Well, let me just try this again. All right, is that better?
There we go. Yep.
You just see the one slide.
Yep, your home page.
Wonderful. Okay. Okay. So thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me today. Just a quick introduction. I graduated from college with an art degree, served as a photographer in the Air Force for 4 years during the Vietnam War era, took a detour going to law school and then practicing law in Washington, D.C. for 45 years, and I'm now back doing what I love to do. My passions are art, history, photography, and writing, and all those interests came together in this book, which I'd like to talk about today. It is titled Bear Me into Freedom, the Talbot County of Frederick Douglass. Is this, Michael? Are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was trying to get Jim.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I just lock up. So, all right, you see just the book cover on your screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, this book deserves a little background. It's nearly 300 pages, but it's more than a collection of photographs. Frederick Douglass was one of the most influential figures of the 19th century. He was born into slavery without any formal education. He became a best-selling author, a charismatic orator, a philosopher, and intellectual leader. He was one of the most popular speakers of the 19th century. Lecture, one of the most popular forms of entertainment. Only Douglass wasn't entertaining. He was a revolutionary, changing the course of American history. I live on the eastern shore of Maryland. Washington, D.C. and Baltimore are on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. The eastern shore, because of its separation of the bay, is a land apart in the mid-Atlantic region and has always been that way. It was on the eastern shore where Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 in an area called Talbot County in Maryland, a short distance from where this photograph was made in the month he was born. Talbot County is an unusual county. It is in the Chesapeake Bay estuary, the largest estuary in the US. It has the longest shoreline of any county in the United States. It is riddled with rivers, creeks, and bays, as this photo shows. In the 1600s and 1700s, trading ships from England could sail up to the wharves of plantations along these waterways and load tobacco. The result was this area, though it gets little attention in the history books, was probably the most wealthy colonial area, wealthy wealthiest area in colonial America. And that wealth was derived from the work of enslaved African Americans. I live in Talbot County, Maryland, in a small town called St. Michael's. Frederick Douglass lived in Talbot County for 11 of the first 20 years of his life, including 3 years in the St. Michael's area. Douglass walked along this street past this house. The power of Douglass's oratory came from his slave narrative, his description of what life was like as an enslaved person on the Eastern Shore. His narrative is the most powerful slave narrative in American literature. Now, the amazing thing about where I live is that there is still enough around to hint at what Talbot County may have looked like when Frederick Douglass worked its field and suffered its bondage. This photograph, for example, was made in the cove where Douglass tried to appropriate a boat with his fellow enslaved fellows and then try to paddle to Pennsylvania. They got caught. Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies that were bestsellers. As I read them, it hit me that there should be a book that takes the words of Frederick Douglass and then illustrates them with images taken as close as possible to the places described and in the same season Douglass is describing. I was shocked that despite all the Douglass scholarship, no one had done this. So I'm going to give you a quick tour of the book. And regarding the format, the words of Frederick Douglass are displayed on the left side of the page, and my illustration is on the right. I'm not going to show you the words, but I am from time to time going to read them. For example, here Douglass says, "Sunday was my only leisure time. I spent this under some large tree in sort of a beast-like stupor between sleeping and waking." Douglass was born in an impoverished part of Talbot County on a farm along Tuckahoe Creek. He writes about, and I quote, "the general dilapidation of its farms and fences, the indigent and spiritless character of its inhabitants." He says, "The name of this singularly unpromising and truly famine-stricken district is Tuckahoe." Now, he was raised primarily by his grandmother. Frederick Douglass's mother had 7 sisters. They were constantly pregnant, and all those children had to live and be taken care of by their grandmother because the rest of them were leased out somewhere. Describing his grandmother, he says, "She was held in high esteem. She was a good nurse and a capital hand at making nets for catching shad and herring." But he saw very little of his mother because she was leased out. She was leased out on a farm 12 miles away from where he lived. He says about his mother, "My mother died when I could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her grave is as the grave of the dead at sea, unmarked and without stone or stake." Now, this is an enslaved person's graveyard in Talbot County. They're probably estimated to be could be anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 people buried here. No one with a grave marker. "My mother died without leaving me a single intimation of who my father was. There was a whisper that my master was my father." Now, though he was enslaved, he remembers his first years along the Tuckahoe Creek as idyllic, because basically he could run wild. Nobody cared about what he did. Nobody was trying to teach him manners or do anything. He was just a wild kid. So he says, "The first 7 or 8 years of the slave boy's life are about as full of sweet content as those of the most favored and petted white children of the slaveholder." But of course, that didn't last. And when he was 6, he was taken to the home of his enslaver, who lived 12 miles away. Now, his enslaver was the chief overseer of the largest plantation in the mid-Atlantic, the Lloyd Plantation. And Douglass describes the walk there, his 12-mile walk at age 6. "It was not until the afternoon that we reached the much dreaded end of the journey. Great houses loomed up in different directions, and a great many men and women were at work in the fields. All this hurry, noise, and singing was very different from the stillness of the Tuckahoe. Now, where he was at that time on the Lloyd plantation was really the center of economic and political power in the mid-Atlantic. The person who owned the property then was Edward Lloyd. There's a series of Edward Lloyds, lived like royalty. He was Edward Lloyd V. And Douglas, was living in basically the kitchen area of this plantation. Now, this plantation, I mean, this is hard to get your mind around, consisted then of 13 farms and 50,000 acres. That's a lot of land in the mid-Atlantic. Douglas says, keen as my regret and great as was my sorrow at leaving the latter, I was not long in adapting myself to this, my new home. Now, his new home was basically an orphanage for about 80 enslaved children, and he slept in this closet, which was right next to the kitchen fire, the main kitchen fire. And they just had a tow shirt that covered him, no clothes, no blankets, no nothing. He had a gunny sack that he would pull over him and climb in, and that's how we would try to get through the winter, sleeping in that gunny sack. And as far as eating, this is how they ate. The mush, this corn mush, would be put in this trough and then set in front of everybody, and then they'd fight over what was in the trough. And what you see there are oyster shells and bits of cedar shingles that have been broken off. Those were the eating utensils for these kids. So what the book does is basically, go through his life, show how he lived, how he was enslaved, how he was brutally beaten at one point for 6 solid months on a farm run by a slave breaker. And all that time, he agonized over how to escape. But escaping then, since they really didn't know where they're escaping to, they're escaping into the unknown. They know where they wanted to end up, somewhere north, but they had no idea how to get there. And the book goes through those 11 of his first 20 years. He eventually, from Baltimore, did escape north and went to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and from there became this international celebrity because, he wasn't like a lot of the white New England intellectuals theorizing about slavery. I mean, he was a living embodiment of it with the scars on his back. And later in life, after the Civil War, he always had this soft spot for the Eastern Shore, and he returned, and he had this tearful reunion at one point with his former enslaver, and then many other people, including going back to the White House there and meeting with them as well. And he describes this whole period as a time when, or that how time makes all things even. And what I'd like to do, since I got a little extra time, I want to, before I go to the book, get your questions. So, oh no, wait a minute, okay, well, somehow I lost my last slide. Let me go back here. Just a sec. I'll go. Well, anyway, I'm gonna read you. I have one shot which got buried here, unfortunately. It's a shot across the Chesapeake, and maybe during the Q&A, if someone's talking, I can try to bring it up. And there's 2 sailing ships coming down the Chesapeake, and he would look at these boats sliding by, and he wrote what he calls this apostrophe. It's probably the most beautiful thing that Douglas wrote about his youth. And it says, You are loose from your moorings and free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks and under your protecting wing. The glad ship is gone, and she hides in the dim distance. I am left in the hell of unending slavery. It cannot be that I shall live and die a slave. I will take to the water. This very bay shall yet bear me into freedom. So, Michael, that is my presentation. If I'd known I'd have more time, I'd show you some more pictures, but there you go.
Okay. Beautiful project, Jeff.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Jeff?
Jeff, tell us how you conceptualize the images. They're very thoughtfully composed and very well linked with the words you chose.
Well, yeah, this is a 5-year project. It took 5 years. I got the idea after reading all through his biographies, and then I wandered around, taking pictures and really getting absolutely nowhere. And it was really COVID that did it. And, we were locked up for 3 months, basically. So I reread, there's one biography that, done by David Blight that is probably the definitive Douglas biography. So I read that biography, then Douglas's 3 autobiographies, which contain just an incredible amount of detail. And then basically I went through and I selected all the passages I wanted to illustrate. And once I did that, I had my shot list. And instead of just wandering around, I would get up in the morning and read a passage. Okay, all right, how am I going to communicate that? And then I would go out and, things just fell into place then, because I was looking for something very specific and trying to portray a mood of some sort. And it was really that shot list that did it. And then, then I would talk to people who lived around here, and if I ran into a problem, I always had a lot of people that could suggest shots for me as well. I'll go back here. If I just slide back up here, you're still seeing my screen?
Yes.
All right, I'm just gonna, let me go, this one here, I probably shared the wrong thing, but this shot here, this shot is obviously a panorama, but it's a panorama. It's 7 HDRs stitched together, 21 files. But that was the easy part. Then the hard part was, throughout this book, we've had to go back and remove everything from the 20th and 21st century. I mean, telephone poles, telephone lines, heat pump units, security lights, satellite, or we just had to scrub everything back to try to get it to what it looked like in the early 19th century. And I think we pretty much succeeded. Because one thing is, it's amazing how this county really, it's changed a lot, but not much. If I were to go to Baltimore, so he shuttled between Talbot County and Baltimore, and he lived in Fells Point for 9 of the first 20 years of his life, along the harbor in Baltimore. But if you go back to Baltimore, there's hardly anything there left that you could use to do what I've done here in Talbot County.
Okay. Anybody else have anything? Let's see. Jeff used Brilliant Graphics in Exton, Pennsylvania as his I guess we call them publisher.
Well, they were the
Um,
printer.
the
This-
printer and
Yeah, there's a museum here in St. Michael's Museum, and they were the publisher, and I used Brilliant.
okay,
printer.
as
Yeah.
did the design work and the printing. Very good. Any experiences with them you might want to pass on to us?
Yeah, yeah. If you want to do a photo book and you want to go to the best place in the country to do it, maybe the world. I mean, Brilliant is right up there. I spent a lot of time researching, trying to figure out, where, who should print this. And there were people that suggested printers in Verona, Italy. There's several really good photo book printers there in Spain. But it turns out one of my photo books is the Sally Mann book that was done for the National Gallery of Art. And Exton, Pennsylvania, where Brilliant Graphics is only a 2-hour drive from my house. I drove up there, walked in, and knew instantly this was the place. And Peter Philbin, who did the Sally Mann book, was assigned to me to do this book. And it is one of the most enjoyable printer things to do. Where part of it, and I didn't have too many of these in here, but there were a lot of times when Frederick Douglass was in a nighttime situation. Or I have one photo where his mother talks about his mother coming through the woods, no artificial light of any kind. And how you can still get enough details in the blacks to communicate that nighttime setting is remarkable. And they are just a delight to work with.
Okay. I guess
Do you have any future projects that you're working on?
I
And-
tell you,
And what's
when,
what's the arc, for example, of your work in general?
well,
Right now, we're looking at kind of not landscape, but images that reflect the meditations,
Yeah.
What's the range of your work?
Well, years ago, when I was a photographer and I was stationed the whole time in Southern Illinois, I do have a book, something that had meant all my life to turn into a book. I might do that, but this project, it's kind of an amazing project. For one thing, when I started out, and first of all, you meet all these different people here that I never would have thought, in all the different communities, and I am kind of buoyed along by all the interest. I get it done, and then I start doing the standard book talk. And I, like this, but one thing that's missing is, I'm not African American. I'm an old white guy, but I found someone, this young fellow, his name is Lance Morris, who has this beautiful voice. He's African American. And we have started in the last month doing these presentations where we go through a much longer, about 80 slides. I do the narration, I run the PowerPoints. He is the voice of Frederick Douglass. And it is the most powerful thing. I mean, we did a performance like this last Thursday, and and we do it in the dark. All you can see is the images on the screen, and not us even. The lights came back on, and we said, are there any questions? And it's like 100 people in the room and nobody raises their hand. I was like, oh man, we bombed. And then I look around and everybody's in tears, and that is primarily because of Lance. I mean, just his reading. I mean, we have one line at the end that's my line that I can never say because I'm usually choked up. So he does that closing line. So then other people have said they would like an exhibit. They'd like exhibits in different places based on this book, and so I'm working on that. So I don't know. This thing just evolves on its own, and it has this life and energy of its own. And I'm just riding the wave at this point. So we have this kind of sound and light show, then an exhibit. So who knows where it may end up, but I'm totally wrapped up in just just pushing this message out, basically.
Okay. Well, if nobody else has anything for Jeff, normally we pass it on to the next guest. It would be Jim, but since Jim's not here, this is Jim's book, which was also done by Brilliant. And it is a gorgeous book also. So we'll try to get Jim to come back at a later date. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up today. Next month will be on Saturday, March 18. So hopefully we'll see you all then. Thanks everybody for coming. Before we go, most important thing, Jeff, where can they find your book?
At that link there, bearmeintofreedom.com that you see on the screen. And that is where it can be purchased.
And I was just told there is a question in the chat before we go from Barbara. Were you pleased with Brilliant's publicity work?
Yes. Yeah. They're the CEO is Bob Tursak, a delightful guy. And they were very pleased. They were very helpful. And I know a lot of people just rely on them for marketing. I mean, I've worked with them, but then I've done many other things for the marketing because well, there are a lot of photo books out there, so it's hard to get attention.
And Barbara, for what it's worth, an email from Brilliant is how I found Jeff's book. So that's why he's here today. And on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next month.